Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. My name, of course, is Brianna Griffith. This week, we are going to be airing segments of a forum that I helped to organize called Democracy for Whom. We looked at sort of the state first of Texas voter suppression and generally voter suppression within the United States, and sort of asked harder questions about like whether the U.S. is or ever has been a democratic society. A really interesting conversation we had there. And then later we sort of compare the U.S. Democratic system and the boundaries of quote unquote U.S. democracy with other systems that attempted to implement more radical forms of democracy. That is to say, socialist systems that included democracy within the workplace. It included sort of expansive union rights, expansive tenant rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so we look at essentially what democracy means in different contexts. We break down sort of the farce of quote unquote capitalist democracy and so much more. The first speaker you'll be hearing is Izzy. And then we will have Luis, who speaks later on in the episode. I hope you get a lot out of both of these. I think these are very timely. They were recorded before the election. There's a bit of a delay between the time I record my episode and the current events that happen. There's basically a few days in between. So this was from a forum on November 1st. Anyway, without further ado, here is Izzy.
The histories of the United States and Texas alike tell the story not only of the victories and defeats of the political parties vying for control of the country, but also of the tools those parties used to entrench their political power. With political parties representing the interests of the elites that fund them, they find a need arise to maintain power over time as they implement policies that go against the interests of the working class majority. Political leadership has embraced this strategy wholeheartedly, and voter suppression has been a part of the American political landscape from the country's very founding. Voter suppression comes in many forms with many different justifications. Politicians and scholars may talk of the, quote, tyranny of the masses, or seem very concerned about, quote, voter fraud. But in the end, these supposedly good-intentioned measures are just voter suppression by another name. From outright denial of the right to vote to the more subtle tactics of voter intimidation, increasing the difficulty of voter registration, forcing polling locations to close, purging voter rolls, and gerrymandering, the common purpose reveals the goal: to prevent working and oppressed people from voting, especially people of color, the young, and other marginalized groups. At the founding of the United States, voting rights varied by state and by and large only allowed white men who owned property to vote, with a small number of states allowing women or black men to vote, providing, of course, that they met the property requirement. The democracy of the United States was built on the foundation of the interests of property owners. Over the next 100 years, while the requirements of owning property was relaxed, the few states that had allowed black people and women to vote stripped those rights away. As if to add insult to injury, in a bid to increase their power in the federal government, Southern states claimed the representatives granted them by the Three-Fifths Compromise were there to represent the black people enslaved by them, without whom they claimed their economies could not function. The democracy of the United States was built on the foundations of capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Following the Civil War and emancipation, states that had previously been the largest slaveholders found themselves with a newly enfranchised population, but maintained great freedom in choosing how to run their elections. They used this freedom to great effect, with Jim Crow laws coming into play and bringing poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. This was not merely in the interest of the Southern states, as the federal Supreme Court decision in the 1876 case United States versus Reese, which found these laws constitutional on account of their ostensible race neutrality, goes to show. Texas Democrats found they could legally run white-only primaries, thus only putting forward candidates for the general election whom the white constituency considered acceptable. Not content with the powers granted by the law to suppress the vote, the KKK emerged as a paramilitary group to commit extralegal murders, lynchings, and to intimidate black people, and to maintain white supremacy. The interests of women, who still did not have the right to vote, and of people of color, who were denied the ability to vote through systemic oppression, were so effectively oppressed that it was more than 50 years before the next milestone in voting rights with women's suffrage. And it was not until 1965, with the Voters' Right Act, that outright methods of voter suppression hitherto used gave way to more subtle techniques. Up until the 1960s, Texas Republicans used fabricated groups to hide their true identity and to publish flyers falsely warning black voters that they could be arrested for voting had they ever so much as been questioned by the police or pulled over at a traffic stop. The 1960s also saw the use of poll watchers enter the stage as a new tactic of voter intimidation, a tactic that is still in use today. Responding to Richard Nixon's defeat in the 1960 presidential election, the Republican Party set to work on Operation Eagle Eye. More than 100,000 poll watchers went to the polls, primarily in large cities with high proportions of the population consisting of the working class and minorities. Charles Barr, assistant to the president of Standard Oil, stated in an interview that they expected to, quote, successfully challenge or to discourage from voting 1,250,000 people, while at the same time denying doing anything discriminatory. The justification will sound familiar to any who are watching the rhetoric of today's GOP, preventing voter fraud. Voter fraud, as a justification, is a significantly larger fraud than any committed by voters. Even the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank which maintains a database of what they consider to be proven cases of voter fraud, only lists 1,298 cases of voter fraud from more than 2 decades contained therein. For 146 million registered voters, that's 1 case of fraud per 15 million votes. Yet time and time again, prevention of voter fraud is used to justify the tactics of voter suppression. In 1964, when Travis County Republicans claimed to have found more than 1,000, quote, fictitious voter registrations, a reporter at the Austin American-Statesman uncovered that the discovery was actually that of a clerical error. Each address was off by a single digit. Texas Republicans have leaned heavily on this claim, and reacting to the victory of Barack Obama and with the support of the right-wing poll-watching group True the Vote, Harris County voter registrar Leo Vasquez claimed that the nonprofit organization Houston Votes was part of a, quote, organized and systemic attack of fraudulent voter registrations. This, too, proved quite the overstatement. The claimed fraudulent registrations were a mix of non-citizens who had indicated as such on their registration forms, and forms that were incomplete or incorrectly filled out. Vasquez, as registrar, had needed only to dispose of the improper registrations, but that, of course, would not provide justification for further voter suppression. Poll watchers associated with True the Vote have frequently been accused of harassment, and the group actively seeks out military veterans and otherwise intimidating-looking volunteers. The 2013 Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder struck down one of the few tools that had had any success in limiting voter suppression, the Pre-Clearance Clause of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This clause required certain states to bring proposed changes to their election laws to the federal government for approval prior to their implementation. The states on this list were primarily Southern and had been chosen for inclusion based upon clear histories of active discrimination and voter suppression in their laws prior to the Voting Rights Act. In her dissent, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, "Voting discrimination still exists today. No one doubts that. But the court today terminates the remedy that proves to be best suited to block that discrimination." With the declawing of the bill's pre-clearance clause, voter suppression efforts have sprung forward once again in ways so brazen that the federal government had previously intervened. But make no mistake, voter suppression never left this country. It has merely shifted to more subtle forms as it is needed to. Texas presently has one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country, requiring a photo ID in the form of a driver's license, a passport, a military ID, or a gun permit, all forms of identification that are less likely for poor people and people of color to possess. A law that has been repeatedly ruled by federal judges to have been written with discriminatory intent. These voter ID laws had previously been stopped by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Texas announced their plan to pass a voter ID law on June 25, 2013, the same afternoon as the 5-4 Supreme Court decision against the pre-clearance requirement. While restricting the ideas that could be used to vote, Texas also denormalized the registration process, taking away automatic or built-in ways that people would often register to vote. For example, in violation of federal motor voter laws, Texas did not offer voter registration at the renewal of driver's licenses. And once again, the state of Texas was rebuked by federal judges. Texas Republicans, even under the circumstances today of COVID-19, have consistently worked to limit polling locations and voting by mail. In 2019, Texas lawmakers prohibited the use of temporary voting sites during early voting, a move primarily affecting college campuses and targeting young people who are more likely to fall on the political left. Governor Abbott's one concession to COVID in the 2020 election was a single-week extension to early voting. Even this was too much for the GOP, who immediately sued the state to prevent it. Despite the real risk to public health of in-person voting, Texas Republicans have echoed their party's national stance to the delegitimization of voting by mail, with Attorney General Ken Paxton and the GOP fighting the expansion of voting by mail and conceding only to extend it for the elderly, the disabled, and people in jail, as if this disease were not taking lives indiscriminately. Similarly, Governor Abbott, on October 1st, ordered Texas counties to limit in-person mail-in ballot drop-offs to a single location, a move that cannot even carry the sham justification of fraud. Republicans nationwide have been working to oppose voting by mail, as seen in the 5-3 Supreme Court decision on the day of Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation to allow Wisconsin to discard ballots postmarked prior to the election which were received after. In this year's primary, over 800,000 ballots were counted in Wisconsin, meeting that standard, ballots which were cast prior to the election. Perhaps most alarmingly, the state of Texas has worked hard to intimidate voters, utilizing the police to aggressively investigate and punish minor violations of voting law with severe sentences. In 2016, Crystal Mason cast a provisional ballot in the presidential election while on supervised release from charges of felony tax fraud, an act she did not know to be illegal, and a mistake which was easily caught by election officials such that her ballot was not counted. Despite the mistake having no consequences on the election, Mason was sentenced to 5 years in jail, and again the state separated her from her children. In 2019, Texas Secretary of State David Whitley ordered police investigations of over 100,000 Texans for illegally voting. It later became clear that the list was junk, consisting largely of people who had at one time held a Texas driver's license or state ID who were not citizens at the time, but who had later become naturalized citizens. All of these acts of suppression have been justified under the nebulous idea of fighting so-called voter fraud. In Texas, as in so many other states today, fear of voter fraud is used to justify increasing difficulty of voter registration, limiting polling locations, restricting voting by mail, and incredibly harsh sentences for minor violations of election law. Yet as Christopher Hook put so well, quote, Republicans have run Texas for almost 2 decades. If there's widespread voter fraud, one would think they'd have found it by now. As with the Chupacabra, voter fraud is greatly feared, but rarely seen. And all of these acts of suppression are merely the tip of the iceberg, which stretches deep into our political structures. Gerrymandering is rampant throughout the country, with our courts having which our courts have explicitly permitted as long as it falls upon political and not racial lines. In the 2002 Texas redistricting, the Travis County area was cracked to parcel out the residents of the city into nearby heavily conservative rural areas. Looking at a map, District 25 stretches from Dallas to San Marcos, largely covering rural area, but with a single offshoot into Austin to split its voters. The state of Wisconsin is so gerrymandered that analysis of the maps showed that Republicans in the state would win 60% of the seats with a mere 48% of the vote, an analysis which held out in 2018, when a Democratic Party majority in the vote led to them winning a mere 36 out of 99 seats. Caging lists are commonplace in states, calling into question voters' registration status and calling into question their right to vote. Ohio's 2005 House Bill 3 required mailing all registered Ohioan voters a non-forwardable notice 60 days prior to the election and compiling publicly available lists of addresses from which those were returned undeliverable. These lists were intended for individuals and groups to challenge voter registrations, a process that did not require the state to even notify citizens of the challenges. Even more damningly, Ohio law allows for people who moved within the 28 days prior to the election to legally change their address at the polls. Under this law, people who were legally allowed to vote were purged from voter rolls due to a single piece of undeliverable mail. The democracy of the United States was built on the foundations of voter suppression. Our political leaders do not even deny this. Paul Weyrich, who was instrumental in writing the 2014 Texas voter ID laws, said, and I quote, "I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the election goes up as the voting population goes down." Democrats in Texas and across the country could be fighting these efforts tooth and nail, but only a few Democratic Party campaigns in Texas are calling out voter suppression, and none are making the expansion of voting rights a crucial part of their platform. Our Constitution states that a government can only be legitimate with the consent of the governed, and our government has chosen to use voter suppression to create a veneer of consent while stripping the voices of the poor, of the working class, and of minorities. Our major political parties have used voter suppression since the founding of this country and have consistently used the power they gain in the legislature and in the courts to increase their ability to do so whenever they are so able. As long as this is allowed to continue, our government can only represent the wills of those who choose which voices to oppress. And history has shown time and time again that those interests choose to unabashedly discriminate against Black people, against people of color, against the poor, against the young, against religious minorities, and against the working class. Texas has faced such massive voter repression, and yet people continue to push back, to struggle heroically. We salute this and also encourage people to think beyond this repressive system, to reimagine what a constitution and what democracy can look like. The PSL believes in a democratic system where voting rights for all, as well as rights to good jobs, healthcare, and democratically organized workplaces, are enshrined in the Constitution. A better world is possible if we fight for it. Thank you.
That was the first speaker, Izzy, who was speaking on basically, voter suppression, particularly in Texas, but also throughout the United States, that history of voter suppression and the different kind of names and different, strategies that are used for voter suppression, including, of course, the defending people from the so-called quote unquote tyranny of the masses, another form of voter suppression that's that's as akin, I would say, to kind of the liberal capitalist class as it is the conservatives, that fear mongering over the quote unquote tyranny of the masses and quote unquote populism. I'll leave the speakers actually do this today, but wanted to kind of get that in there. So I just want to once again stress that we are essentially, we recorded this forum a couple days before the election on November 1st. it kind of is going to air later in the week. So I don't know at this point what kind of unprecedented things we might be seeing or what situation we might be in as of the time this podcast airs. So I decided to kind of air this educational, this essentially set of educational speeches on democracy more generally, and we'll kind of see how things play out in the next few days, and we'll kind of see how that goes. Anyway, I'd like to get to the next speaker, which is going to be Luis. You've actually probably heard Luis on my show if you're a longtime listener. Luis has had a kind of recurring guest segment to talk about Latin American politics, so please stay tuned for that. It'll be absolutely great, and I just want to remind people, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned for the second half with Luis talking about what is democracy in just a second. Welcome back to People's Republic. I'm going to launch right back into it. This is the second half of our forum that was put together this past weekend on, this essentially past weekend on November 1st. We talked about, basically what is democracy and democracy for whom when the capitalist class talks about the U.S. being a democracy, for whom is the U.S. a democracy? So to talk more about just the general meaning of democracy, to really break down other democratic systems as well, or to break down, I would say rather true democratic systems, democratic for the working class. We're going to hear from Luis now. So this is Luis's commentary on democracy.
So I'm just going to go a bit into more general concepts of what democracy is and what it has looked like in the world throughout history. So let's start with a quote by Lenin. Lenin wrote, "Bourgeois democracy, although a great historical advance in comparison with medievalism, always remains, and under capitalism is bound to remain, restricted, truncated, false, and hypocritical, a paradise for the rich, and a snare and deception for the exploited, for the poor." That's Lenin. He wrote that in Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. So the word democracy is a critical centerpiece of American rhetoric, adding to the many tried, familiar platitudes filling U.S. political discourse. Former President Obama said about the 2018 midterm elections, "You need to vote because our democracy depends on it." George W. Bush, during his presidency, used democracy as a euphemism to describe military occupation of the Middle East. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson spoke out about the need to make the world safer for democracy. There are countless such examples in mainstream political rhetoric. Taken literally, democracy is rule by the people, but who are the people who do this ruling? What kind of ruling is it? It is not just anyone in a given society who counts as the people. To begin with, we should consider the composition of the elected bodies of government. By and large, elected representatives in the United States are either members of the bourgeoisie or the wealthier segments of the petite bourgeoisie. 2/3 of senators and nearly half of all members of Congress are millionaires. To boot, Congress is for the most part men, 80%, and for the most part white, about 81%. In comparison, around 11% of American households consist of millionaires. Half of Americans are women, and 62% are white. If representatives aren't rich before they get in office, they are certainly rich afterwards when they begin lucrative careers as lobbyists or consultants. One cause of the disparity is wealth, which acts as the great gatekeeper to elected office. In the past, property requirements assured that only 6%, a selective capitalist clique, would be represented in legislature, and one could clearly expect the clique to elect from among themselves. Today, any candidate who runs against a member of the bourgeoisie, if not in possession of a great deal of capital, must make their case to one who is in possession of a great deal of capital. And this cannot be done without making an appeal to represent capitalist interest once in office. For the oppressed nations in the United States, such as the nation of Black Americans, this is a significant hurdle in the way of real representation. In total, Black families in the U.S. have 1/10 the wealth of white families. A quarter of Black families have zero or negative net worth. Similar statistics are to be found for Latin American families. It is clear to see that informal economic requirements for office ensure far-reaching limits on the impoverished, oppressed nations of the U.S. Moreover, the interests of the American bourgeoisie are in direct conflict with both the capitalists and the workers of the oppressed and occupied nations on American soil. For example, real self-determination for these nations would require substantial reparations, which the bourgeoisie would never allow to happen, and in the end will require expropriation of the capitalist private property. So we already see pressing political issues taken off the table simply by virtue of the political structure in place in the US today. One of the most fundamental aspects of true democracy, as Comrade Izzy was talking about earlier, is the capacity for members of that democracy to vote. However, in U.S. democracy has always had strict requirements for suffrage. At the time of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, one had to be a white property-owning man to vote. A critical section of this demographic at the time were slave-owning aristocrats, though over time the U.S. capitalist class would cleave into competing groups, northern industrial capitalists and southern slave-owning holdouts. In any case, this selective franchise left about 94% of the American population without a say, a revealing fact about what the founders of the United States intended when they founded a government of, by, and for the people, quote unquote. Certainly not the inclusive egalitarian democracy one hears of in grade school lessons. This is the type of so-called democracy offered by capitalism. So for some historical examples of non-bourgeois democracy, we can turn to the examples of the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution. So one of the first examples of non-bourgeois democracy society was the Paris Commune, which came into being after the first ever seizure of power by the working class in Paris in 1871. In the chaos of the Franco-Prussian War, as soldiers of the French army departed Paris, the Parisian working class and the Paris National Guard seized political power. Violent clashes with the National Guard had caused the government to retreat from Paris in hopes of maintaining stability. The Parisian National Guard was distinct in key ways as compared to the French army, the former having a radical left-wing outlook and closely aligned with the Parisian working class, and the latter loyal to the bourgeois government of France. The French army, expelled from Paris, was replaced by the armed working class itself. The new commune was administered primarily by working people themselves, elected by the entire populace through universal suffrage. Governing officials were paid an average worker's wage and could be recalled at any time. All of this stands in stark contrast to bourgeois democracy. The sky-high wages of elective officials in bourgeois democracy, the class composition of bourgeois governments, the unaccountability of elected officials who could carry on as they please without the threat of recall. As Marx wrote, quote, "The vested interest and the representation allowances of the high dignitaries of state disappeared along with the high dignitaries themselves," end quote. The councillors, the elected body of the commune, did not distinguish legislation from executive matters. For this method of carrying out state affairs, there was no massive bureaucratic apparatus appointed rather than elected, accountable only to other bureaucrats rather than the citizens themselves. There was no distinct judicial branch enjoying appointment for life, answerable to no one but themselves. The commune was administered by a single working group who could be dismissed if they were not serving the people, answering only to the broad working masses rather than the ousted bourgeoisie. The Paris Commune only lasted for a few months before it was eradicated by the French army, but it was a glimpse at what would be possible once the working class had the strength, the organization, and consciousness required to seize power. Significantly, the workers knew that they could not simply occupy existing government posts and carry out the functions of the bourgeois government. Rather, they replaced the existing government in Paris with something genuinely new. Perhaps one of the most famous and pivotal manifestations of worker-led uprisings and revolution was the 1917 Russian Revolution. This began with two hard-worn democratic institutions in early 20th century pre-revolutionary Russia. The Russian Duma was instituted in the midst of the Revolution of 1905. From its founding until its end in 1917, it remained for the most part ineffectual and dominated by conservative and reactionary elements, save for a handful of workers' representatives. On the other hand, the workers' councils, or Soviets, were genuine instruments of proletarian political power. These councils first came into being during the 1905 revolution, but were dissolved when the revolution was defeated. The Soviet system of democracy was revived as the Russian Revolution unfolded throughout 1917, and with the advent of the October Revolution became the legitimate governing bodies of the newly established Soviet Russian Republic. Following the fall of the Tsar, Russia was ruled by the provisional government, which did not recognize the Soviets. The Bolsheviks rallied around the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," despite forming a minority in them. Even though the provisional government was formally the legitimate authority in Russia, the Soviets were growing in support and the provisional government was impotent and generally unpopular. The situation came to be known as dual power. The bourgeois and proletariat had their own governing bodies in competition. By the end of 1917, power rested firmly in proletarian Soviet hands. The Soviets were composed of and represented the will of the workers, the peasants, and the soldiers. The right to vote was extended to all Russians above the age of 18 who were employed in productive labor and belonged to a labor union, with some exceptions. The Soviets represented a radical political advance for Russia and the world. The Soviet system continues to represent a form of democracy superior to the vast majority of allegedly democratic systems in existence today. Lastly, we can look to a more contemporary example of what it means to have a worker-led democratic society. The Cuban Revolution brought Cuba out from the state of profound political and economic inequality. 20th century Cuban politics before the 1959 revolution were marked by alternating periods of bourgeois democracy and military dictatorship. Throughout the latter part of this period, however, the military leader Fulgencio Batista called the shots from behind the scenes, despite the occasional outward appearance of a bourgeois democracy. American capitalists enjoyed Cuba as a tourist destination as well as a business opportunity, while most Cuban people lived in slums, many illiterate and lacking basic life necessities. The advent of the revolution changed the state of affairs entirely. Volunteers from the cities went into the countryside to teach basic literacy. In a single year, nearly 1 million people were able to read and write. Today in Cuba, nearly every person is literate, while tens of millions of their American contemporaries are not. What good to say even for the potential of democracy in each country? In which country does the state take interest in its people being prepared to carry out affairs of government? What this stark difference in literacy suggests is that the participation of the average citizen is superfluous in bourgeois democracy, while proletarian democracy is inherently participatory. The years after the revolution were tumultuous as the new Cuban state fended off counter-revolutionary efforts from abroad, primarily from the United States, as well as those from remaining elements of the Batista regime. To this end, the Committees for the Defense of Revolution, or CDR, were founded as local organizations stemming the people directly to defend themselves against reactionary remnants. Today, these committees have developed into a form of local self-government. They have moved from self-policing in the style of the Paris Commune's armed working class to planning for many social and community affairs, such as administering vaccines, holding forums to discuss pending municipal and national legislation, and even to make proposals on that legislation. Notably, many of the suggestions originating in the CDR make their way into laws. 10% of the economic guidelines governing Cuba's limited private sector came from the masses themselves in the course of consultation with the Committees for the Defense of Revolution. In the mid-1970s, the Cuban state founded the National Assembly for People's Power, which legislates over foreign and domestic politics along with economic policy. The National Assembly plays a strong role in helping plan production and regulating industries. Bourgeois democracy leaves these affairs for the most part to the anarchy of the marketplace. Today, in stark contrast to the United States Congress, women hold approximately half of all seats in the Assembly, while over a third of the Assembly seats are held by Afro-Cubans. 3 of the 6 vice presidents of the Assembly are women and 3 are black. Elections held every 5 years could not look any less like those in the United States. There are no election campaigns like in the US. Rather, beginning at the municipal level, public meetings are held to discuss and debate the merits of potential candidates nominated by the local governments, members of whom are also elected. There is no massive private propaganda apparatus to paint any candidate in colors of its choosing, no sensationalist media to draw huge profits from an election turned into a spectacle. The Cuban people are deeply involved in open discussion about how their society moves forward. Nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in two nation-wide Cuban political campaigns, the development of the 2012 labor reform and the new Cuban constitution of 2018. Each case illustrates the intimate and dynamic relationship between Cuban citizenry and Cuban governance. The civic process that culminated with the 2012 labor reform began years earlier. In the mid-2000s, millions of Cubans began attending public meetings to discuss the state of Cuban economy and the realities of life and work in Cuba. It was on the basis of these grassroots assemblies that the Cuban state drew up their reforms, which were then subject to feedback and criticism from the masses of students, workers, and all broad segments of Cuban society. The state published the completed reforms side by side with its earlier draft, demonstrating how the will of the people had informed its revisions, of a document that itself was the product of civic engagement on the broadest scale. A similar process saw the Cuban Constitution of 2018 drawn up. The National Assembly approved the draft of the Constitution mid-year, and copies were printed and distributed throughout the country over the following months for study. Tens of thousands of citizens facilitated community discussion in order to solicit feedback and criticism of the new document. For months, meetings were held and the popular will taken into account in producing a new draft of the Constitution. How often do the masses of American workers and oppressed people enjoy mass mobilizations to so directly determine such important political changes? Without a doubt, the capitalist electoral system is a sham. It is a rigged system to ensure the domination of the tiny ruling class of Wall Street bankers, corporations, and big business owners over the vast majority of people in the United States, the working class. The electoral system is not the final arena of struggle for the working class, but it is where the attention of workers will be drawn over the next year. Well over 100 million workers, students, and organizers participate in the capitalist elections every couple of years. Those who do not directly participate or forced to listen closely because the corporate media focuses on the elections months and even years before it takes place. This year is no exception. But the elections will sorely disappoint anyone longing for real change. Those who want a better life, a better world, an immediate end to military occupations and war, better wages for workers, free health care, and full economic and social equality for everyone will not get any of those things from the big business candidates currently on parade. In the United States, two capitalist parties dominate political life inside the system. Candidates from the Democratic and Republican parties bask in the glow of the electoral contest. The contest, however, is really one between two parties of war and exploitation, two parties of extreme wealth. It is a bankrupt exercise. In order to secure an electoral victory, big party candidates spend millions of dollars on their campaigns. The financial support from powerful corporate interests is a must. These candidates from the parties of big capital do not represent the interests of workers or oppressed people. They may speak demagogically and pay lip service to the interests of the working people, but they do not mean a word of it. All of the pro-corporate candidates, time and time again, have pledged themselves to manage the affairs of the ruling class if elected. Their campaign platforms may articulate the outlook of different wings of the ruling class, but at the end of the day, they all have the same goal. All capitalist candidates could share a single slogan: profits over people. That is, if they wanted to tell the naked truth. This year, Joe Biden, the supposed progressive alternative to Donald Trump, has publicly stated to his corporate donors and the people of the U.S. that nothing will fundamentally change, and went so far as to pledge an increase to the budget for police departments if elected president. This in the wake of massive protests across the country and worldwide to demand an end to police brutality, a serious and historical and racial problem that was greatly exacerbated by Biden himself when he wrote the 1994 crime bill, allowing the overcriminalization and mass incarceration of Black and brown people by extending tough-on-crime policies, which were actively upheld by his running mate Kamala Harris during her time working as an attorney in California. These capitalist candidates are fighting tooth and nails in the election process to control the US, the state, and local government apparatus and their right to direct, along with bureaucratic government agencies where the trillions of dollars of government contracts with big business will go in years to come. They are also battling to control the state's repressive apparatus, the police, military, courts, and prisons, the real source of capitalist power. The US electoral system is reflective of a capitalist plutocracy. We live under a government of, by, and for the wealthy. These politicians are beholden to their corporate backers. Even if they started off with humble backgrounds or espoused progressive positions earlier in their careers, not one politician will be able to become president of the United States unless they adjust their positions to that which is acceptable to the capitalist vultures at the military-industrial complex. Each one of them will embrace the goals of the U.S. imperialist domination, or they will be dumped unceremoniously by the Republican and Democratic parties. None of them will forward the working class struggle. They aim to get elected not to serve the American people as they claim, but to serve the minuscule capitalist class. We can compare this to the recent elections in Bolivia. After multiple delays in presidential election, movement towards socialism, or MAS, presidential candidate and ex-Minister of Economy Luis Arce Catacora was elected by over 52% of the popular vote according to preliminary estimates. The crushing victory of MAS deepened as the party won a majority of seats in both chambers of the legislature. MAS is the party of Evo Morales, the democratically elected president who was overthrown in a US-backed police and military coup last year. Morales, a prominent union leader, was the first indigenous president in Bolivia's history. His administration ushered in a process of deep progressive change called the Democratic and Cultural Revolution that empowered the country's working class and indigenous majority. In the lead up to this past weekend's elections, the coup regime pulled out all the stops to prevent the people from exercising their right to choose their country's leaders. In multiple instances, they attempted to ban the MAS party from participating by removing their candidates altogether or individually with fictitious criminal proceedings. The campaign of Arce and MAS was consistently persecuted, with offices and radio stations attacked. Additionally, the election was delayed. In March, the pretext for the postponement was the public health emergency of COVID-19. Another delay was attempted in late July and early August, but the Bolivian people took to the streets, organizing blockades and marches to demand a binding official date for elections. This pressure from below secured the October 18 elections. The weeks and days prior to the election saw a profound militarization of cities to create a fog of uncertainty and potential chaos. Military and police were deployed while social media was flooded with images of thousands of soldiers marching up and down streets. Coup regime minister Arturo Murillo threatened international observers with jail time. He also threatened to take harsh action against anyone who protested against electoral fraud. This rhetoric was not taken lightly, as the coup government had earlier in its tenure committed massacre of its opponents that left dozens dead. The most infamous of these took place in the towns of Sacaba and Sencata. As international observers began to arrive, some were harassed while others were outright detained. Although later released, Federico Fagiolo, an official member of the observer mission of the Argentinian Congress, was arrested in El Alto airport 2 days before the election. On the day of the election, in complete contrast to the mood created by the coup government, the Bolivian people peacefully filled the lines of voting booths from the cities to the countryside. The Bolivian people stood up to vote for sovereignty and regain their democracy. This is a humiliating blow to the far-right regime of the coup-installed president, Janine Áñez, and is being celebrated by the left across Latin America. This is why revolutionary change is needed. It is clear in the exploitations of workers by bankers and corporate CEOs, the racist cops jailing and killing Black and Latino youths, the millions of families losing their homes to foreclosure. The starting point is that for millions of people in the United States, for the vast majority, in fact, the system is not working. In an advanced capitalist country like the United States, the rule of the tiny minority is held up by a vast network of ideology, myths, and propaganda that justify the unjustifiable. Despite the illusion of choice and variety illustrated by cable television offering 1,000 channels and internet media from every corner of the country, the message is remarkably uniform. The system of capitalism, despite its problems, is the best of all the possible worlds. It is based on human nature. Humanity is corrupted, whether by greed or by original sin. So exploitation is natural. That's the sort of myth that they're pushing. But despite this mythology of the invincibility of capitalism, history has shown that capitalism cannot exist without people's resistance, protest, and rebellion. This is why we must strive for a socialist future, to create a society in which workers have genuine capacity for self-actualization and can dictate the circumstances of their own livelihoods. By socialism, we mean the goal of our struggle, a world free from exploitation, racism, war, and oppression. By socialism, we mean the efforts to construct that society, including the experiences of those revolutions that have uprooted capitalism and began constructing a society in the interest of the working class. Thank you.
And if anybody has, in addition to comments, any questions that they think, please share those as well.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like these were two like incredibly great speeches, and such an important. It's such an important kind of analysis to have, this analysis of like what democracy means, because there's always, I think a lot of like capitalist ideology really works by essentially taking concrete things and making it seem more abstract. So like when a capitalist government fails, it's always, oh, this is how government is, or this is how human nature is, as Luisa kind of said near the end, and like really showing how radically different like a socialist government can function is such a powerful counterpoint to that argument. It really kind of makes it obvious how hollow that is. And yeah, that whole idea, like all of the things that, all the things I always hear about Cuba, all of that level of participation, like the fact that essentially you have a council, you have kind of group of people that you can get together like with your fellow tenants or whatnot when you're discussing like sort of housing issues in your community. You and the tenants in that building get together and you discuss it, and then you bring up those points, and you don't have to, like, it's not a fight with government or kind of local agencies. It's a cooperation with, and that's on the one hand that, like, just that level of organized, like that level of organization, being able to, just talk openly with your tenants, with your other tenants, and that you decide essentially what's happening with regard to your housing, rather than just a landlord telling you what they won't, what they will fix, and you don't have any recourse. And then that ability to then actually have that put into practice with a government that, again, like no government is perfect. Like, we live in a society, but like that ability to really cooperate toward a common end, of securing better housing for everybody, just to use one of many examples, like it really, it's such a powerful thing. And it's like, I also think that's the kind of work that we, just generally, like, people on the left need to be doing, is like sort of tenant organizing and whatnot, generally speaking, like, organize those bodies now, organize the unions now, organize the tenant unions now, and sort of, present that challenge. And I guess one other point, sorry, I've gone on way more than 2 minutes, is with regard to the election in Bolivia, like, really the actual election in Bolivia, for those people who might be like, oh, you can vote out fascism or you can vote out reactionism. Well, it's like, no, not really. The elections in Bolivia only happened because of a year-long struggle by the coalitions involved with MAS, the indigenous groups, the unions. Like, they were struggling against this coup government right from day one. And so basically, after a year of struggle, they were able to win the elections because they pushed back so strongly, because they were already so organized that they were able to essentially make these elections happen, and they were able to prevent what would have been massive voter fraud. So yeah, it's about people power.
Yeah, that's really excellent. And I think one thing I'd love to add to that is, and and especially as far as my own ongoing education goes, one of the things that American capitalism has been so successful at is colonizing the mind to believe that the way that America does things is the only democratic way to do a thing. And then we'd go and we turn around and we look at China and say they don't have democracy and they don't have these freedoms. And the answer is what they have just looks very different to what we have. And in so many ways is much more democratic and free than what we have. And so trying to free our minds and reimagine these systems to get to a point where we can even to see the possibilities, having grown up within the confines of this system that works so hard to make us believe that the only way is what we have now, goes on to things like when I was talking about voter suppression and whose right to vote is enshrined in the Constitution, that it has taken multiple amendments and still has not done an excellent job to ensure that the right to vote is universal.
I think that's a really great point, Izzy. Talking about like the U.S.'s version of democracy, it's really interesting that every political philosophy considers their version of it as democratic in some way. Like no one ever like creates a system that says that they're undemocratic. It's like there's no country in the world that says we're number two, you know. But yeah, I think that a lot of the ways that our like democratic system is set up is with the intent of atomization on a super strong level. So instead of creating collective action or direct action or protesting or creating unions or organizations, like a lot of the ways that we're told that we practice our democracy is by a personal like choice that we make in the voter box alone, like quietly and without anyone knowing it. And a lot of ways, like that's the ultimate form of atomization because it just turns into a consumer product that we have where it just like, I buy brand X, well, I vote like party X, but it doesn't really have anything outside of the, you know, potential cultural ramifications or cultural ideas that are behind it. There's not really a strong sense of organization among the actual people. And yeah, like what Bree's comment was saying earlier, like the Bolivian election was the victory lap. Like the protests in the streets were the actual fight.
Speaking of how pervasive this narrative that capitalism pushes to sustain itself, it's funny to think about how funny, you know, quote unquote funny, to think about how the advent of democracy, the mainstream understanding of the advent of democracy, which is that it started in Athens and it was like a complete direct democracy where people gathered and took direct participation in the functions of their society, which first of all, it was still extremely undemocratic because a hugely small section of citizens of Athens were allowed to do that sort of thing, just like now. But in that narrative, it's like, oh yeah, this romanticization of taking this direct involvement in society. When you see something happen like that in contemporary times, like in Cuba, it's like what happens in Cuba is more closely tied to that idea of what democracy is and like the birth of democracy. But when it happens, it gets like the capitalist class tries to stomp it down as hard as it possibly can. So to me, it just goes to show those kinds of contradictions show how not just how undemocratic a capitalist ruling class society is, but also how fragile it is, that it can't have anything pointing to that threatens its legitimacy.
That was Luis, the second speaker at a forum that I helped to organize a webinar on kind of the nature of democracy and comparing sort of capitalist democracy, quote unquote capitalist democracy and socialist democracy, and sort of looking at alternatives, especially to capitalism, obviously. So Luis was the second speaker, Izzy was the first speaker, and we had a little bit of the Q&A after that. I just want to stress this was pre-recorded on November 1st, or this was recorded on November 1st. It's hard to tell. Or it's hard for me to make predictions on kind of what's going to happen between like the time I'm sending this to air and the time it airs, with the instability in the world. So for the time being, I'm going to kind of keep focusing on community forums that I've been a part of, or a different, not just community, but also kind of webinars and whatnot. But yeah, I hope to get, given the insecurity around the election, given the instability that may occur around the election, I hope to kind of go back to, recording those interviews once I have a better sense of what's going on. Sorry for being kind of in and out through the month of October, but, it's nice to be back on the air. So this has been People's Republic. This is Brianna Griffith, and I hope you will tune in next week. I think we're going to be hearing from Gloria La Riva, the presidential candidate for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.